So, hey everybody, I just want to say first of all, this is awesome, thanks for coming. So I wanted to thank the foundation, the IGDA Foundation, IGDA.org/foundation. They made it possible for David Gibson from the Library of Congress to join us today. So thanks to them. To Chris.
I want to just thank the IGDA for securing this room for us, for a topic that might not be as sexy as the latest podcast panel or something else. But I'm glad everyone lined up here for a topic that I've been involved in kind of casually and editorially for a couple of years now. And I think it's something you're going to hear a lot more about as the problem becomes even more exacerbated and as more groups get involved in it. Is video game preservation. I'm going to let each one of our panelists introduce themselves and talk about what they do and their interest and their kind of professional background in this, since they're going to do a better job of it than I am. Let's start with John Gibson.
Hello, I am John Gibson. I founded IM8bit way back in 2005, which is an art show that pays homage and tribute to the wonderful classics of yesteryear. Basically from 1995 and before polygons became so prevalent and pixels were so dominant. And it's an art show based on interpretation, but at the same time it's a celebration of vintage, classic, awesome stuff that is often forgotten. And it's not just the Zeldas and the Donkey Kongs, it's about everything. And it's about what we saw when we were looking at that screen with so many limitations. So that's my gig.
I'm Dave Gibson. No relation that I know of to John. Yeah, we haven't figured out how we're related yet. I work at the Library of Congress in the moving image section, actually, which is primarily film and video. But around 2006, right after I started working at the library, there was a decision made that all of the video game materials that we already had in the collection and all the new games coming in were going to start coming to our facility in Culpeper, Virginia, which is sort of out in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the state. So right now I'm working with some other colleagues trying to define exactly what we want in terms of what we receive through copyright from different game companies, in terms of building up our collection, and also just trying to do some outreach to collectors in the area and nationally to make up for some of the huge gaps in our collection, because right now what we have physically only really goes back to the mid-90s, so we're trying to go back and get the equipment and the actual games to sort of build up our collection and start to think about doing some actual preservation of games in the future.
So my name is Chris Melissinos. This is my fourth PAX I'm speaking at. I was the Chief Gaming Officer at Sun Microsystems for about 12 years and focused on everything from client side to server side tech, but been a gamer my whole life. Started programming at 9, first fully formed game at 12 in assembly. My parents had no idea what the hell I was wasting my time with these confusers for. And I am the curator at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, putting together the very first video game exhibition for the Smithsonian. 6,000 square feet of video game art at the museum in Washington. So we're here to talk about that as well.
Hello, I'm Henry Lowood. I'm the curator for the History of Science and Technology collections at Stanford University, and also for the Film and Media collections. When my parents were worried about me, it was because I was reading a lot of history books rather than playing games, although I was doing that too. At Stanford, we've had a very large collection of games since the late 1990s, so we had a little bit of a head start. And we've been worrying about that collection. I've also been writing about history, and my group is one of the 4 groups in the Preserving Virtual Worlds project that you may have read about.
So, how many people in this room know about the Smithsonian show that Chris is involved with? There's a lot of people. How many people have voted so far?
How many people are angry at some of the omissions?
Okay. Well, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about the idea of a public voting process and why the show isn't entirely publicly curated?
Sure. So Yeah, it's interesting because it really highlights a lot of the problems that you have when you're curating an exhibition or figuring out which pieces to keep in an art show or which pieces that are actually going to make it into these permanent collections. You can't get everything in there. So the goal of this exhibition was to first create a dialogue with the public that says, okay, we're going to now show you the artistry, the mastery, the storytelling, the humanity behind a lot of these games you played that you may not understand. And we're going to do it through a fixed lens. We can't do everything in the setting of an art exhibition. Remember, it's an art museum, right? So things tend to be big, giant rooms, these tiny little prints on walls, and I didn't want that, but at the same time, I can't over-rotate and completely make the entire, curations have to go crazy. So the goal was to focus this down. And rather than have it be my picks over 80 years, I have 43 game consoles at home, multiple, arcade machines, just ridiculous amount of stuff that my wife's very patient with. Bless her, right? But having kids lets me also use that as, I'm playing with the kid. I said I could just pick 80 games and be done with it. But that I didn't feel would serve the people that are coming to see this. This is as much about the people who play games, because the one thing about video games versus any other form of media is that there is a dialogue, there is a third author to this, which is the player. And so it's how everyone plays these games and puts themselves into it is important. So I wanted you to have some semblance of vote to help steer this, to make sure that things that we were choosing, you did have some voice in making sure those games were there and those are the ones you wanted to see. There'll be something in there for everybody. It doesn't hit everyone, no. I know there's no Planescape Torment. I know it's Oblivion over Morrowind. Okay, there's a lot of reasons for this, but we won't delve into that now. But I wanted the public to have some voice in the exhibition they were going to come and see.
Henry, this idea that you can't pick everything, that sounds like the foundational logic behind the digital game canon. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that project and.
Okay, let me first start by telling you that there's an organization that you should know about, the IGDA, International Game Developers Association Preservation Special Interest Group. So there's a special interest group at the IGDA devoted to preservation and history of games, basically to making sure that this culture around games is preserved and games themselves are preserved and so on. And through the IGDA, about 3 years ago at GDC, we launched an event called the Digital Game Canon, the idea of which, it was actually inspired by a project the Library of Congress is involved with in the film industry, where every year a certain number of films, American films, are identified as being especially important within film culture. And they're on kind of a list, and that list then becomes a basis for talking about the most important films that need preservation attention. And we thought we would do basically the same sort of thing for games. We did that in 2007 at GDC. We identified the first 10 games. It went great. It was a very well-attended event. We had, Steve Meretzky and Warren Spector were on the panel, Chris and I, Matteo Bittanti. It's a great event. Well, for a variety of reasons, changes with GDC and so on, that event hasn't been able to continue with GDC as a venue. And what we're trying to do with Joystick, the Preservation SIG, with IGDA, and we're trying to get some other institutions involved, is to get that going again. And maybe, Chris might talk a little bit more too about some of the mechanics of what we would like to do through Joystick. But basically, we want to have a process where a lot of people are involved in participating in the decisions that are made every year, maybe 10 games that are really, really important for game culture, and they go onto this list. I'm hoping to learn a lot from all the bruises on Chris's body from having done this at Smithsonian, and maybe, maybe even the work that he's done could also feed into what we're doing. But that's the basic idea behind the digital game canon, and the panel basically today is a way of relaunching it.
So the first digital game canon in 2007 was the 10 games were Space War, 1962, MIT, Star Raiders, Zork 1, The Great Underground Empire, Tetris, SimCity, Super Mario Bros. 3, Civilization, Doom, Sensible World of Soccer, and Warcraft. So there's probably a lot of familiar names in there and a lot of unfamiliar names. And the challenge was, coming up with games that we felt were important. So for example, I picked Doom instead of Wolfenstein, Super Mario Bros. 3 instead of Super Mario Bros. 1. And there was a lot of debate internally about which games were important and why they were important. But instead of just picking the 10 best games ever, which is something that I think there's probably 2 panels here at PAX. There's one going on at South by Southwest yesterday with the same topic. Any event you go to, you'll have 10 best games panels over and over and over again, nonstop, ad nauseum, and it's sort of to no end. The goal here is to not pick the 10 best games, but maybe the 10 games that need to be reserved, not even the 10, but every year it's the 10, and the 10, and the 10. And building up kind of catalog, a canon of games that we all recognize and acknowledge deserve to be preserved. We can't preserve everything, and maybe with limited resources, and David can talk a lot about that, we need to really focus a lot of our efforts on maybe what's most important, where we should be focusing our attention. But Dave, can you talk a little bit about the challenges you've had at the Library of Congress and the challenges of preserving video games in general?
Right. Well, I mean, the central concern right now is, we are collecting a lot of the physical artifacts and, collecting a lot of the games themselves and a lot of the, supporting documents that go along with them, playing guides and other things, advertising. But we haven't really figured out yet how we're going to provide access to these things, and we certainly haven't figured out how we're going to, go beyond, what we currently are doing, just in terms of sort of like, because we're very used to a certain mode of preservation, which is very, in a lot of ways, analog based, and so we have to sort of reapproach this whole thing from a more digital perspective, try to figure out exactly what is preserving a video game. I mean, it's very easy to say, because we have hundreds of years of experience with film and things, to say, okay, the original camera negative, the film that was in the camera when the film was being shot, is like the first thing. That's like what every film archivist, craves, to get that, because then you can make lots of very beautiful prints from that, and it'll look, like it was made yesterday. But in terms of gaming and in terms of what we actually are trying to pursue, obviously a lot of work has been done with the Preserving Virtual Worlds program, and trying to talk about, the importance of source code, and things like that. So we're still trying to go after that kind of thing, and start a dialogue with game developers and game companies, where we can actually say to them, like, this is what we will need. This is what we will need to be able to preserve your work into the future. I also want to talk a little bit about, just to sort of compare the game canon to the already existing film registry that exists. The way the film registry works is there is a board called the National Film Preservation Board that meets every year to discuss the films that they think are, should be named to the list. There's also a public vote, so it kind of works in a similar way to the Smithsonian public vote. And then eventually what happens is sort of the 2 lists get cobbled together, and the Librarian of Congress decides what ultimately, what 25 films will be named that year. And normally the criteria that is that it has to be something that is either groundbreaking or different than something else that's already on the list, and it sort of runs the gamut. But it'll be interesting, yeah, if we can somehow steer the canon in the direction towards, having it embraced in a similar way to how the film preservation list has been embraced by the library. It'll be interesting to see how, the upper echelon of the library reacts to it. Because it's been interesting to see, certain films that have not been named to the registry. For example, Pulp Fiction continues every year to be snubbed because the librarian thinks it's a filthy, violent, profanity-filled movie not worthy of recognition on a list, when a lot of us, film fans disagree. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Certainly violence is going to be a problem.
Right, exactly.
I'm still waiting for hackers to make the list.
Right. I'm still waiting for Tron to make the list, and I've argued twice, 2 years in a row now, because I was like, computer graphics. I mean, if you're going to look at computer graphics, or
Not really relevant.
yeah. If you're going to look at CGI in film and where it really began in terms of storytelling, let's look at this. But that's a whole other issue.
Are there certain rules and stipulations? Like you say, the library is against violence?
No, it's not. It's not that there is necessarily any rules. It's basically, that's just like kind of down to his personal opinion about that particular film. I mean, the only real rule is that it has to be 10 years, 10 years old, and have contributed somehow to just cinematic art in some way. But yeah, he just has a vendetta against that one. Groundhog Day is on, and Pulp Fiction is not. It's all right.
So John, I was hoping, talking about working with the companies, right? Letting the companies know what is needed. You've had a lot of experience working directly with companies on marketing efforts to promote their games, and especially thinking about your work with Capcom and the Curator shows. It's through a lens of the history of this game series. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience working with companies and how aware, how savvy they are in regards to preservation.
Yeah, I actually had a stint in animation a couple years ago, and there's this thing called executive turnaround, where every 3 or 4 years in development, the entire department gets wiped out, like just gone. And the same thing happens in PR and marketing and in every single department in every single place. And so therefore, if you're at Nintendo, you're at Capcom, you're at any of these companies, there's a regiment, an army of guys that know what's going on in the moment. And then they take off and go someplace else. And then everything they did is slightly forgotten. And that's happened enough times in gaming history that companies like Capcom have storage facilities, and they don't know what's in them. And they only have a certain amount of space to archive. So every 3 or 4 years, all these people leave, and then all these boxes just kind of get pushed off to the side. Then occasionally those boxes will get thrown in the garbage, and they don't really know what's inside. And it's really, really sad, like when we go in and we produce an event for Street Fighter, or we do something for Nintendo, and we ask for assets. And we're like, well, do you guys have this artwork from 1995? Or one good example is Mega Man 9. We made a press kit that embodied the really, really shitty box art from the 80s for Mega Man 1. And we wanted to do a piece of art that was so bad it was good, but not so bad it was bad. So it's memorable amongst gamers as being probably the worst piece of box art of all time, at least in my humble opinion. In mimicking that, we were trying to research, like, well, who did the box art? Do you guys still have that painting or that color pencil piece? Whatever. We couldn't even figure out how it was done. Who did it? What company? Who sourced it? Like, how much were they paid? Was it even an agency or was it someone's friend? And no one knew. Like, there was no way of tracking down all that information. And that was just 1987. That wasn't really that long ago. And there's, a couple other decades before that where video games are just dying. Like, all that information is just going away. And we have guys like Nolan Bushnell and all these dudes that are still around, but they're not going to be around much longer. And like it's their legacy and it's their memories that are the legacy of games for the most part. Like even personally with my family, I've been talking to my mom, and she's the only one that remembers, her great-grandmother's name. And once she dies, it's like her entire family legacy is gone. So it's like I feel like even personally, I'm responsible for it. And it's like there's very, very few people right now that know what's happened in games in the last 50 years.
So the Capcom story, is that surprising to anybody in the audience? I mean, would you think that, raise your hand if you think that's pretty surprising. Right, so a big part of the reason we're doing this is because it is surprising. And you'd think that companies with these major brands would maybe internally recognize how valuable and important they are, and the reality is that they don't, even the biggest companies, don't have institutions or rules or processes in place to preserve what they're doing every day. I know that there's one company that does have a librarian or an archivist, and that's Blizzard. Can you?
Very smart.
Yeah, and Blizzard's also got the money.
That's the thing, though. It's no one's fault. It's like it's not Nintendo's fault. It's not Capcom's fault. It's like there's no one person designated. In Japan, they're way more diligent. Like they do have stuff. But
Well,
at the same time, they don't really do it in such a hardcore way that it's like they're prepared for the future in a really resilient way.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a fault, but it certainly is a glaring oversight. You talk about art for things like a Mega Man cover, without saying the name of the publisher. A friend of mine who was working on a project asked for the source code to a title that included a principal property of this one publisher, and they didn't know where the source code for the game was. Source code, art assets, or music. It was found on it was found on a floppy disk, still in the drive of the sound engineer's machine that he took when he got laid off and was sitting like under paint cans behind his car in the garage. Like this is how they got the source code for a game that had principal character, principal property. So we could say it's not their fault, but it is their fault, right? I mean, and a lot of it happens to be, companies say, well, this is a product that's gone and shipped to market. Companies are getting dissolved, or their divestitures are happening, and things getting shuffled off, and they just, kind of disappeared. Maybe we'll resurrect it at some point, or we'll just get somebody to recode it. I mean, that's not the way to curate this. I mean, you're exactly right. We're losing this history.
Well, there's a whole market now of developers like Other Ocean and Foundation 9 and Backbone that have made their mark, like resurrecting all this stuff. And it's like they're specialists in it now, and companies have to go to them to fix this.
Right.
And it's like, but it only happens when there's money being made, and if you put on the Wii and sell 50,000 units of something that is super easily converted, then it's going to happen. But there's a lot of games that it's not going to happen for.
Well, you bring up Other Ocean. So Mike Micah, you talked to him about playing games, in emulation or playing through a downloadable. There's a difference between doing that and then understanding that, original systems through original connections to the television, there's a beauty in that. There's noise in the signal that a lot of times, if you read books like Racing the Beam, that developers said, well, a TV works this way, and so I'm going to use that deficiency as a way to go and make the art look proper. And when we try to convert, now we get in the case of, well, now we got to try to write filters for modern television so they look like old shitty tube television. I mean, we're kind of back in the space where, as J.P. Dyson says from the Strong Museum, the Rosetta Stone worked for humanity in deciphering hieroglyphics because we had a key. And in the games industry, we have all of these keys that are generational, and unless we're preserving that hardware, those artifacts in which to interpret these things, we're going to lose this history.
Yeah, let me put this in a little bit of a context. Think about the kind of companies that game companies tend to be. So I've been doing something at Stanford since the mid-1980s called the Silicon Valley Archives. So high technology companies, as they were called back then, companies like Apple and Varian, which doesn't even exist anymore, and HP and so on and so forth. And very similar problems occur with high technology companies generally. Very few of them have archives. Very few of them do a good job with things other than business records or very high level kinds of records that they keep, because that the central administration of the company tends to be really well organized about these things, but the people over in the labs or in the development parts, they're busy cranking stuff out, right? So game companies are, to an extent, technology companies. They're very much like the technology companies I know about from my experience. But game companies also have intellectual property and assets, cultural assets, art, that kind of thing. And it's kind of interesting to me because where there are quite a few functioning archives are in the domain of the entertainment industry. The entertainment industry does a reasonably good job. If you look at Disney, LucasArts, companies like that, they have archives because they're very concerned about that intellectual property. And the game, this is where it's odd, where we're kind of the surprise that you guys showed has to do with the surprise about companies not guarding this intellectual property. I think part of the explanation is because game companies are also technology companies, and they're also racing a mile a minute, moving on to the next project, doing things like that, and they're not necessarily careful about the intellectual property side of it.
Well, there's a challenge too when we're talking about video games as art, right? For a Smithsonian show, and the publishers themselves don't really treat them like art. They treat them like a technology product because they're hustling out the door and moving on to the next one.
Sure.
Companies like Lucasfilm will treat it like art. They'll have archives. So you brought up Mike Micah and Other Ocean. Mike Micah, if you don't know, is the founder of Other Ocean, I think, and he's got one of the largest personal video game collections in the world.
He's got over 6,000 games.
Yeah.
It's awesome. But I can't even think when I go in there. I'm literally, we had museum staff out over at GC. I'm like, Mike, we're coming over. We're going to pull out some stuff in the museum. And I walk in with these two curators from the Smithsonian. I'm like, I can't even tell you what to pick. So you guys just go, and I'm just going to go over and kind of geek with Mike for a little while. It's overload. I can't do it.
Whenever we have excess stuff, I always send it to Mike.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, dude, please take care of this. It's
You're
like,
the guy.
Yeah. But like, I've played amazing games in that room too. Like
Yeah.
Tree Surgeon is like one of my favorite things to experience in there. And like, what the hell is Tree Surgeon? Like, no one knows.
Mike knows.
Yeah, exactly.
Mike.
And he has it, and it's on the right monitor.
Yeah.
It's playing on the right chords.
If I
it's
could just
terrible.
get that basement and drop it in the museum, I'd be done. Like, done. Glad I could help.
And Mike has like shrink wrap copies,
Yeah.
as well as open copies. Like that's what's scary.
Yeah.
So this question of monitors, how many people here have tried to hook up a NES or a Genesis or something to their HD TV? It doesn't work very well, right? It's kind of a disaster. So sometimes it's the upscaling and there's a delay. We're playing the original Guitar Hero, right, on a new system with the lag on the television. So this challenge of also preserving the hardware and getting that to play, and then hardware deteriorates. You won't have hardware forever. Exponentially complicates the challenge of preserving video games. You're not just preserving the game. Emulation isn't the same thing. You've got to actually preserve, soup to nuts, the whole entire experience. And you have, I was wondering if you talk about personal collectors, people like Mike Mega. A lot of the video game preservation effort is happening in people's basements. It's happening in Mike Mega's basement, Chris Melissinos' basement. What's the challenge from and Dave, you too, the challenge from an archival standpoint when so much of this effort is balkanized across tons of different groups that don't necessarily organize themselves?
Yeah, I think this is a really important problem. So you have preserving virtual worlds, you have work that's being done at the Library of Congress, the Strong Museum, Smithsonian's probably going to jump in, different cultural repositories. And while we're just jumping into these problems, the goal of the work that we're doing, the research that we're doing, say, in preserving virtual worlds, is to come up with a solution that's going to last, forever. Whatever, in institutional terms, forever means a really long time. And I think that we're making good progress. So just take that idea that there are these repositories that probably are going to come up with solutions for how to preserve this stuff, how to get these materials into a digital repository, figure out how you'll get access to them and so forth. And, sort of take that idea and put it on the shelf. The problem is the kinds of collectors we've been talking about for one group of people, but also people just like yourselves and your own personal attachments to games and what you collect and so on. At this point in time, the cultural repositories like the Stanford, the Library of Congress, Smithsonian, don't have the reach. We're not as nimble as you guys are, as any of these collectors are. We're not getting to the places where these personal collectors are getting. Things like, Frank Cifaldi is another person I should mention, unfinished games. Collectors collect things that interest them. They're curators, like I'm a curator, and they define their collections because they're interested in some aspect of the industry that they've defined, and they're the experts on that aspect. Like Frank's an expert on unfinished games. The thing is, this is nothing new, really. If you look at any of the major libraries or museums of the world, most of the star collections in those repositories were not collected by the staff of those institutions. They were collected by other people out there in the world who then brought those collections, one way or the other. Sometimes it was wars, sometimes it was gifts, whatever it was, that brought those collections in, and then the repositories took care of them. So we have this problem between these nimble collectors going out there, grabbing stuff, knowing what to look for, getting unique materials, who are they're mortal. They're not going to be around forever. There's only so much those collectors can do to ensure that this stuff is going to be around. Now, the repositories are working towards making sure that stuff stays around forever, but we don't have the nimble collectors that we can just send out and get things. So I think it's a real interesting problem to figure out how we're going to connect these groups. I think digital game canon, it might be part of the solution for that, to get a lot of people involved and talking to institutions so that we can figure out ways in which the work that people do in collecting stuff that means something to them can feed into this process of building collections that will preserve for the long term.
I mean, again, I see a lot of parallels, obviously, to film archiving. I mean, if film archives rely primarily on the studios to provide them with, their back catalogs. I mean, half the stuff that survives from, the silent era and things like that wouldn't even still be here. I mean, a lot of the stuff that survives because someone collected it or someone made a print off, their father was a projectionist back in the 50s or something, and they just happened to have like this print that he like gave to them when they were kids or something. So I mean, I think I see a parallel in that regard, and I mean that's primarily what we're trying to do now is reach out to a lot more collectors, because we realize that, I mean, it's going to sort of be an uphill battle. I think it has been an uphill battle in terms of dealing with the actual companies themselves. So we're starting now to try to start dialogues with collectors and get involved in this network of collectors, so that in the similar way that we build our collection through film collectors, we can sort of build our game collection through game collectors. And I mean, just one example of this was we actually did just have a screening of Tron in our building. I programmed a screening of it from the print that we have, which is really cool because it had the preview of Epcot Center attached to the front of it because it hadn't opened yet. So that was like an awesome little bonus. But when I was introducing the film, I said to the audience, because most of whom were unaware that we were collecting games, I said, we're starting this collection now, and if anybody wants to donate anything or talk to me afterwards about what you might have, and I got about 10 people coming up to me. Some are just like a few Atari games, or some people with pretty big collections of old games who want to donate and help us out. And it'll come into our building, and it'll be given like the name of the person whose collection it is and everything, and it'll sort of like live on and certainly help us when we try to work on these preservation initiatives that we're trying.
Yeah, in LA, every now and then on Craigslist, we'll see these like listings for someone died, and there's this huge garage full of prints, and no one knows what the hell they are. It's like, come get them. And it's like, these are the treasures it's happening in the games too, and it's going to keep happening more and more frequently. We had an event on Friday for Bethesda for Brick, and one of the things with events when we produce them is the fire marshal always comes in and inspects and starts to talk to you, and he can be a dick or he can be really nice. Like, you never really know what to expect. And he came in and I explained, like, no, this is the gamer crowd, like they're really like gentle, like no one's gonna do anything crazy. It's not like a bunch of like gangs coming in that like screw up this like cruise terminal. And he like warmed up and he's like, I was just cleaning out the basement and I found a bunch of boxes of my kids' old games. Like, do you want them? And I'm like, what are they? He's like, I don't know, the thing with, it's like wood grain, like, I'm like, oh, an Atari. He's like, yeah, an Atari, like I have boxes of this stuff. And he's like, I'll bring it in on Sunday. But like, that's what happens. It's like, it's generational. And it's like, he doesn't care, his kids are growing up, and he's just gonna throw it away. Like, literally throw it away, and it's gone. Yeah.
So just to give a quick plug, shameless plug for the IGDA, one of the things that we've talked about in some of the conversations we've had, it isn't enough to love these things and to hang on to these artifacts, and we show them off to our friends, and we do work to put them in a museum or save them at Library of Congress and art show. We have to start getting smart about how we're preserving the information. Right? The reason that something like Wikipedia works is because there are standards by which information is ingested into a system that is global, it's refined over time, people continue to use it. So, they need input from collectors, from people who really care about us to say, okay, if this is how we're going to do it, how am I supposed to record the private collection that I have? Make sure you have access to the information, because it's global. The fact that there are games being released now that will never see a physical form, ever. Which means the problem of curating this becomes that much more of a problem. To the discussion about the Tron print having the front of Epcot Center, that is very different than a second generation print of Tron that wouldn't have it. I mean, that's kind of the original print. And so you could say, well, okay, all things being equal, right? It's not like in games where we could say, one of the things you would bring up, which is choosing, well, Super Mario Brothers 3 over Super Mario Brothers. Well, why didn't you pick the first one? Because the first one is what I had as a kid, damn it, and that's what should be in there, and you suck, and blah, 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 right? No, because the answer is that Super Mario Brothers 3 is the refinement of all the things they were trying to achieve from Super Mario Brothers 1. So if you have to pick one, which one do you choose? But a movie print, the first one is typically the one. Right? So we do have an issue now when we start to look at first issue of digital-only games. As soon as it changes hand once and something is modified, we're going to print a preview to another game, or I'll change the title screen just a little bit to show that I had a hand in it. Then that's not the same as preserving the first. So the IGDA needs your input and help to go ahead and figure out how we're going to go ahead and create a standard by which we curate all this stuff, right? For all of us.
Chris, you talked a lot about, like, when we were initially discussing what the panel was, about context, too, and not just preserving the game itself, but
Right.
what the context of that game is based on when it came out. What was it like? Like, what was your personal experience with it versus the masses? It's like, my experience with Zelda is way different than yours, I'm sure.
Right.
You probably hate Zelda, I don't know.
I
Like,
love
yeah.
Zelda.
You probably like Zelda 2 more.
But I like Zelda Twilight Princess.
No, but it's important. I mean, the one thing with iMeet and seeing people interpret all this old stuff is, you look at a game like Adventure, and it literally has a hero that is comprised of 1 pixel.
Yes.
But like the cover art's amazing, and you're like, it's a dragon, and it's a castle, and you're going and you're traversing this huge maze. It's like you play the game, and it's a square. But like your imagination takes hold. But like now my nephews and nieces and like my kids they don't understand that. It's like listening to radio. It's like they don't quite get it. But like back then that was huge. You were forced to imagine that entire world.
Can I just throw in one sort of term from the archival historical world? So we've been talking about preservation, and I think that means probably to most of you making sure that games themselves are preserved way into the future. Another term from the archival historical world is documentation. So documents, I don't mean, like you're documenting your code or something like that. I mean documents that tell future historians about how people were using games. And this could be, videos, it could be getting a bunch of blogs about a particular game. It could be, in the case of a game company, records from that company. It could be source code. It could be designer notebooks, all of those sorts of things. For example, we've set up, as part of the Preserving Virtual Worlds project, we set up a collection that's on the Internet Archive. You can look at it now, called Archiving Virtual Worlds. That's a documentation collection. It's over 300 videos now of various events or things people did in virtual worlds that they just captured on video. It's not about the making of the game necessarily. It's about what players were doing in that game world or that virtual world. So documentation is equally important. Add to that whether you're a player or you're working in a game company, these are basically very similar issues, because for us in the Silicon Valley archives, many of the important collections we've gotten that contain a lot of documentation have been from people in various labs, people pretty far from the center or the top of the company, who just felt that something they did was extremely important. So they took out, when they left, and no comment on whether they were supposed to or not, but they took out things like, quarterly research reports, correspondence, things like that, that tell about what they did. Some of them really liked the marketing and the advertising materials from their company, so they have those. Many of the most important pieces of documentation we have about Silicon Valley companies come from those individuals who took those things out of the company. So it's documentation alongside the preservation of the original artifacts. We need both of those.
Just one thing, to your point, this is what I was getting at before, is that there are 3 voices in the game, right? You have the designer, you have the characters themselves, and you have the player, and what they put into the game. So one of the things, and then I'll shut up and let someone else talk. So one of the things that's important to think about, and try this with friends of yours or family, right? So you think back, I was flying out to GDC, and there was a guy sitting next to me on the plane, and I was reading Nintendo Power, of course, and he was like, oh, what's that all about? So we were talking, the guy's a little older than me, and he goes, oh, you know what game I remember playing? Phoenix. I'm like, you do remember playing? What do you remember? I remember this big ship that would come down, and we're talking about. I said, and then what do you remember at the birds? Oh, and there were these 3 birds, and how they would, and the guy is like painting it in front of me in the air, right? And he's saying, if you move this way, and I go, do you remember where you first played it? He's like, oh yeah, it was this bowling alley by my house. Oh great, do you remember where it was in the bowling alley? Oh yeah, it was right against this one wall. And I said, do you remember who you were with? Oh, it was with my brother and this guy. Like, do you remember any of that detail about your favorite movie, your favorite book, where you met your wife? Like, it's just right? But it's because games, the amalgam of what games are, it's a social reflection, it's a flashpoint in time that is made up of all of these other environmental experiences, right? And it's something that games, because of its interactive nature, has over every other form of media. It is cemented that way. And you can all sit here right now in this room and think back to a particular game of, I just have this real vivid memory of what the carpet in the house looked like and what the bezel on the television looked like when I first experienced these sorts of things, right? There's no other medium that has this. So, when here's talking about the documentation, all that's part and parcel of this, right? These are snapshots in time that we have to capture because we have an opportunity to do it now. We have an opportunity to do it while the creators and the founders of the industry are still with us. There's no other medium in the world where we have the opportunity to do this.
Well, how do you document memories like that too? Like,
Right.
That's a daunting task. Yeah.
Right, but that's why it requires the participation of everyone that has an interest in doing so.
So I wanted to make sure we left time for audience questions, and I'm hoping you guys have a bunch. But first I want to ask, how many of you in the audience have game collections?
Good job, good job.
How many of you have willed them to Stanford or something? Yeah,
The library.
They can fight over that.
The answer to that question, well, by the way, who to give it to is, I really hope that as the kind of a network of institutions develops, that it becomes kind of maybe a regional thing. I think that kind of ties to the idea of people have memories. Those memories are also tied to places and things like that. So I hope, if you're in California, it makes sense to come to Stanford. If you're in Texas, go to UT Austin. If you're in New York, Strong Museum. Central, East Coast, Library of Congress, that kind of thing. And I hope that there is a network so that you don't have to, if you're in, Rochester, New York, you're not feeling like you have to contact Stanford somehow where you have no connection whatsoever. But there's the Strong Museum, basically around the corner from it. That's kind of the model I have in my head for where we might be in a few years.
When you build those standards by which the information is captured, then when we need to go to collections to do to pull together a timeline, we know where the body of work sits throughout a wide variety, and we can lend those. And we create a global body of information rather than trying to stick it all in one giant warehouse and close the doors.
You know what upsets me more than anything is the idea of arcades not existing anymore.
Yeah.
But the idea of arcades not existing and people not actually remembering anything about those venues. It's like you see this old theater conversion happening with Shakespeare theaters and old silent theaters turning into restaurants or turning into another theater. Tarantino just bought the New Beverly in Los Angeles a couple years ago, and he converted it, and he's still showing movies, and he's showing his personal 35 prints there. But arcades don't get converted; they just get turned into subways.
The minute that gets revived, I got a whole business for Levi's jean jackets, jeans, and quarter racks.
So, I guess we don't have a mic out here. So it's a small room, you can shout. Anyone have any questions? Let's start up front here, gentleman in the blue shirt.
You mentioned earlier the three voices of video games. How do you envision capturing the fourth voice now, which is multiplayer, which a few years down the road, Microsoft just shuts off the multiplayer for the original Xbox. That part of that game is just gone.
Well, how do you know about this in terms of virtual worlds, in terms of preserving things like MMOs and experiences inside of MMOs, which is kind of
Yeah, and does it. I'd leave you with this thought too: is should it be preserved? What in those experiences needs to be preserved? What is its value? What is it? Right? Those are questions that curators have to face every day when looking at preserving these archives.
Well, very complicated and very good question. Part of the answer with virtual worlds goes back to the preservation documentation distinction, and in some cases, in certain kinds of virtual worlds, where there are lots of events, lots of activities, I think the weight of that is going to have to be on the documentation side, gathering lots of documentation about things that happened. Because one characteristic of these worlds that we call virtual worlds, unlike the real world, is that when something happens in the real world, generally traces are left behind in place that help people to document them, or they're scattered, but they're somewhere in that world. Whether it's newspapers that you can go to, or a file cabinet full of stuff, or the space itself for an archaeologist. Virtual worlds have this property that, with very few exceptions, I'm just saying that I can't think of any, but somebody here might think of one. Virtual worlds do not have that kind of those kinds of remnants in them of things that happened in the past. The documentation about events that happen in virtual worlds tends to be outside of those virtual worlds. So a blog that you find on the web, the 2D web, somebody's video of something that happened. If you're interested in something like a massive event that happened in Second Life, or the way people figured out how to do raids in World of Warcraft, something like that, there's nothing much that you'll get just from reinstalling World of Warcraft software or Second Life software. So documentation is a very important part of that. Second point is that some of the issues are technical. Authentication is one issue, like the authentication servers, and but we know those can be cracked and so on. So somebody just needs to get on that problem. It's a technical problem that can probably be solved. Those are the hardware, hard issues in that sense. The soft issues, by which I mean issues of legal issues, copyright, community standards, privacy, those kinds of issues are much more difficult to solve with respect to virtual worlds and game worlds. And the one example I'll give you from the Preserving Virtual Worlds project is we went into that with a naive expectation that because Second Life, Linden Lab, has given ownership of the intellectual property of things that people create in that world to them, that this would be a much easier project than having to go to, say, Blizzard to get permission to do everything World of Warcraft. It actually turns out that because, and we have a technology, we go into Lantern Island, we can survey everything, grab it, we've got all the prims, we know who created them. The problem is, the information that you get, the metadata that you get, only tells you the avatar name of who created something. Everything that's created in Second Life, even an island that I say I created, probably has about 30 to 50% content that somebody else made. So I end up with this inventory with a whole bunch of oddly identified prims owned by various avatars. If as a repository I want to preserve that information, I have to go to Linden Lab and say, please give me the real life identities of these people. I think you see where this is going now, right? So we came up with a process for doing this, very convoluted, trying to work with what was possible to do, and we got something like a 12 or 13% response rate from the owners of these various avatars. You can't rebuild an island with that little control over the assets there. So there are a lot of soft issues that need attention. I mean, the copyright situation, the DMCA, with respect to games is a real problem, but also contract law is a real problem. What you guys agreed to in the shrink wrap licenses, the terms of service and all of that, in some cases copyright law doesn't even matter at that point. You've given away a lot of rights that you would have had under copyright law, and it makes it much more difficult to deal with things. So there's your question opens up a whole bunch of problems that I could go on for, but I think you get the idea.
Good place to start. Anybody else? How about the red hoodie?
Going off an earlier point, how do you deal with documenting games now where you have things like bug fixes, patches, and updates, wherein the game content is changing from when it first launched? How do you decide if you're going to include, say, the first update of the game or whether not to include it? How do you figure out if you're going to curate that or not?
Well,
just people.
What we would do typically, we package up the data that we want to put into a repository. And the package, the envelope it's sometimes called, includes data and what we call contextual metadata that tells you things like how are text and images specified, and how do you make a replay in this game, how do you run it, so on and so forth. So in that package, like when we did Doom, what we did was I'll take the blame, selected specific versions of Doom that I considered to be especially important. So I analyzed, which early versions, which beta version, where were there significant changes, which versions were played widely or maybe had historical importance. And that's the way I approached it. That I basically just then took each of those versions in their completed state, not all of which were completely accessible, by the way. But then another approach, now I see games that are entirely server-based, where there's hundreds of patches that occur over the lifetime of the game, where in some cases I think we're looking at a future where there will be no frozen state on a physical medium at all, ever. it's just going to be something that's been changed, evolves on a server. I think this is one of the issues where we're not there yet in terms of figuring out how we're going to address that, but it's something we know that we have to address.
It's surprising, that's where most coders or software houses do a really good job of documenting, which is in versioning, right? Because there are legal issues, there are press issues, there's all sorts of playability things. So having worked for a company for 16 years actually, whose principal product was code, and yeah, they take really detailed notes when it comes to patches that are going out. So at least we have the documentation to show what had changed over time.
Patches are an interesting part too. If you're looking at something like the digital game canon, which version of a game are we acknowledging or recognizing here? When you have games that are iterative, you can look at Mario 1 versus Mario 3, but then there's Doom, and there was a lot of versions of Doom.
Yeah.
And you end up, especially with games released today, where you have day one title updates, it's just the nature of software development. They're a lot more complicated, that these aren't static things, and they kind of challenge a lot of the kind of antecedents here, which would be film, doesn't really have the same challenges. This would be like, picking Star Wars, but picking the new versions where, where Greedo shoots first. Because
how does that even make sense?
I would never do such a thing.
Yeah,
you would allow it, but just...
Let me raise just one real quick point related to that. This relation, documentation and preservation aren't entirely separate things. So let's say we're talking about Warcraft 3. And I decide that I am going to here are the important versions of Warcraft 3, and I pick 1.05, 1.13, blah blah blah, whatever they are. But it turns out that there's a really important tournament that completely changed the way the game is played. Grubby did this or that, but the replays, that game was played with a version that I did not choose to save in the archive, and the replays of that game that I have access to are in that version, and I haven't chosen the right version of the game as part of my archive. So the decision I made about which version of the game to archive is going to determine what documentation I can actually see. And if I make the wrong decision, or if the game preservation guys aren't talking to the archivists and the documentation people about that, then we're going to have a pile of documentation over here that we can't do anything with because we haven't preserved the right version of the game.
Even more so, how do you guys decide Xbox versus PlayStation? I mean, there's so many different versions. It's an interesting challenge, like with all these ports all over the place. What is superior? Like, is any one superior?
Right, and since we get, most of what we get for our collection right now, it comes through copyright. So we get every platform. I mean, EA will put out a game for 9 different platforms, and we'll get all 9 of those games. And it's like, you have to decide, we then have the problem we normally have times 9, basically, like how we're going to deal with all of these things.
Well, I mean, that's actually a very real problem that I just had to face, that some of you that voted probably saw, is that people like, Grandia on the PlayStation, why is this moron, why does he have it here on the PlayStation, that it's original platform? This guy doesn't know anything about games. It's like, well, because we already had 3 choices on its original platform, but the game was important enough to preserve or acknowledge. So we put it onto we have as an option a secondary platform, so it has a chance of making it in. So sometimes it is more about the preserving what was important about those games versus the platform that it originally emerged on. So it's a mix of things. It's a very difficult balancing act that you have when trying to go in and tease out games and materials that resonate, that set forth genres, that set forth mechanics, that did things. So sometimes they may be preserved not on the original platform, but on a secondary platform, just because of limitations you have in an archival system or an artificial set of boundaries that are put up for an exhibition.
Other question? Let's go a little towards the back. How about the guy right back there with the white long-sleeve shirt on?
My name is John Anderson. I'm author of an article that was just published on Gamasutra.
Great article, by the way. Thank you. Read it.
Thank you so much. It's called Where Games Go to Sleep, the Game Preservation Crisis. Third and final part was just published on Thursday morning, and companies like Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo, and 11 other different companies talked about how they're preserving their games. I had companies come forth like Irem, and they admitted to me that they lost all of their source code from their games in the 1980s. Microsoft's just backing up their stuff. Microsoft Game Studios is just backing their stuff up from pre-2000. Taito's lost game promotional material. anyone here that's from a game development company or publisher that would like to share how they're preserving their games, there's a questionnaire on the third and final part of the article at the end where you can answer questions about how you're preserving your games. It's all right there at gamasutra.com. But one of the challenges that I had, I contacted 61 different companies over a 2-year period, 3 different times, and only 14 responded. And the issue is getting their attention. Will you all be approaching ex-game designers, people who are game designers, developers, producers, artists who are no longer with the company to see what they have in their own archives, in their own personal archives, to see what they could donate?
You certainly would like to start doing that. Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of forming those relationships, and I think part of as long as the library is involved in the IGDA and the Donor Preservation Group, I think we'll be able to at least get the word out to these people that we are now dealing with this issue. And as soon as I had our contact listing on the IGDA SIG wiki, I got 3 emails from not people in the industry necessarily, but people who had large collections that they want to start to work with us on. So I'm hoping that I'm just hoping this network sort of expands and that we can start to have those conversations with X game developers.
Let me mention, when I started the Silicon Valley Archives at Stanford, 1985 or so, I guess, we sent out 100 letters. I got one answer out of all those letters when we started. The answer was from Doug Engelbart. How many of you know who he is? Ooh, that's bad. The inventor of the computer mouse, basically the guy who invented all the technology that went into windowing and the kinds of user interfaces that you're familiar with. It's one of the most significant collections that we've got, remains to this day. One of the most significant collections we have. People are using it all the time. But over time, so on the one hand, okay, so a few people respond, but you still may get some great collections. But also over time, once we had the Engelbart papers and other things started coming in. People at Xerox PARC, for example, were very interested because they basically used what Doug did for the technology that eventually became, the Alto and so on and so forth, and then eventually became the Macintosh, and some of you may know the story. Apple, I'm sure, was interested in us because of that, and that's how we got the Apple History Collection. So today, I don't really contact people very often about the Silicon Valley Archives because so many people contact me about stuff they want to get into the archives that it kind of runs itself almost. But that's 25 years later. Okay, so it's going to be a situation for the first few years where only some companies will participate. I'm sure of that, but hopefully some of those companies are going to be beacons for other companies, and they'll kind of get on the bandwagon after it starts rolling.
I think it's also outlets like Gamma doing that 3-part article, Joystick, and getting people in the room here aware of what's going on. Like you said, you were all surprised to hear it. If you've been talking about it a lot, it's easy to forget that the audience might not remember, might not even realize that these companies aren't taking very good care or responsibility of the products they release. So, did you have another point?
Well, I heard, just to build on the libraries, I got a very shocking response from someone in Sweden who runs a Swedish video game museum called Spelmuseum. And he told me that their national library, that is actually by law supposed to preserve video games, preserve like everything from the history. The librarian, a very elderly woman, threw video games out in the trash. And
let me just say that doesn't come as a huge surprise.
So that's another problem.
But I won't go into any further than that. Let's just say that the games came to the moving image section for a reason because no one else wanted to.
But that will be something in a follow-up that will be on Gamma Sutra is emphasizing the importance of librarians to keep games in their libraries and their archives.
And just as a quick point too, I wrote a book about Ralph Bakshi that came out a few years ago, and he's the guy who made Lord of the Rings and First the Cat in the 70s. And the only reason we were able to actually make the book was because he saved everything himself. Like he, for the last 50 years, archived every single sound, every poster, every drawing, every production design, everything. Ridiculous, even the film prints. And the irony is, and this is how reverse it is, for us to do the book, we got all that stuff from Ralph for free because he was collaborating with us. And then we had to approach and find out who owned all of it, and then license it from them and pay them money for things they didn't even know they owned. So for like the general public to see a lot of this stuff, even after it's archived, like there's a whole other like cluster of stuff to deal with before you can even see it printed or displayed in various manners too. So like as much as you might like a certain game at the Smithsonian exhibit, there might be a company that just won't let you show it for some reason.
That's exactly right. And, last thing is, good point as well. This isn't going to get fixed until we get companies to take responsibility for it. In doing research, we had to get 240 licenses, right, in a very quick period of time. Thank God we had an awesome staff at the museum doing it because I would have just dragged my way through it. The problem is talking to developers, major designers on these games. They're like, I've got a ton of stuff in my personal archive I can't show you because I don't own it. I created it for these companies, but I don't own it, right? So unless we get the companies to start doing their job in preserving this for future generations, it's going to be a very difficult problem.
Anybody else? Let's go over this side.
Just a quick question about the practical aspects of the game canon. How is it meant to service the Preserving Virtual Worlds project? Would the idea be that every year when 10 new titles are inducted, would they then be packaged up to use that sort of repository somewhere as well?
So we did, in fact, of the 10 or so games we did in Preserving Virtual Worlds 1, I think 6 or 7 of them were from the digital game canon. And so I would, the situation is, in a working library, resources are not going to be unlimited. We're going to have to make decisions, and it's fairly resource intensive what we have to do now to prepare this packaging. When you heard me talk about Doom, I'm sitting there selecting, it's my time, I'm selecting which versions to do, I'm having to talk to metadata librarians about what's going to happen there, I have to coordinate stuff with people in the digital repository, all this stuff has to happen, it costs money, staff, etc. So we have to make decisions on, we have to make choices. And I think to have a list, a canon that we can refer to where we can say, this is important, working on this game is important because there's been agreement on it, that would be a major factor.
And I mean, the way it works with the National Film Registry and the National Sound Recording Registry is, when a film gets nominated or named to that list, the library gets, in the case of the films, we get like the best copy, best print that the studio has of that film, and in the case of sound recording, we get like master tapes for those. So I mean, it then encourages the studios and the record companies to sort of provide us with their best elements, and so I'm hoping in some way it will be a similar.
Well, I guess for the packages, they would not have to have that same weight to the original, would they? They
Right.
would be housed in different repositories, though. Unless we at one point have a national repository for video game history.
Yeah, another thing I could think of that I think is important here is that the IGDA behind it, which gives us kind of access to companies that we don't, have maybe coming from Stanford or Library of Congress or whatever. It could be a program. It could be an award that's connected with it. An event every year, which is what we want to do, and that maybe will get a company interested in having somebody assigned to survey what they have and make sure that one of these repositories has a copy of that. That would be the ideal way that things would work.
Yeah, so it's partially a matter of limiting the amount of work people like Henry have to do. Here's 10, not a million. And it's also frankly, a prize type of thing. It's an acknowledgement. So if the companies want to get involved with this, if it's high profile, if it's something that people actually pay attention to, like the people in this room, the companies would maybe think about that relationship. And maybe it's tough with some games like Space One. You go talk to, give them, it's not different, but then there's some games like Nintendo or Capcom, companies that are still active today that have a rich history that deserves to be preserved, that don't necessarily do it themselves. So we only have time for maybe one more. This is so hard. I'm going to go with the guy right back there, black shirt, Half a gun your wrist. Was it a girl?
It was a girl.
Girl, yeah. I don't have my glasses on.
It's the girl gamer.
I know. Actually, but I'm librarian. I understand the desire not to have emulators exclusively, but at what point do you say, look, I don't want to become a computer museum? Because I know NARA, for example, is always saying, well, we will accept these formats at this point. We are not going to deal with this anymore. Because they don't want to have to maintain, in your case, so Sony CD, we don't want to, or Sega CD, you don't want to have to be doing that. You don't want to be the guy who has to maintain 3 or 4 televisions. I mean, where do you decide this is not going to be we're not going to be a computer museum, we're going to be an archive, and if you are doing, everything on the original system, how do you serve that to researchers?
I guess it depends on how accurate you want your collection to be, and what it is you're preserving. To Henry's point, are you preserving just the documentation about this game? Or you're actually trying to preserve the artifact itself, and so that may require a different institution, different group doing that Rosetta Stone archival, right? I mean, it is important to have that. I mean, as we move further and further into systems that are purely playing the digital space, where digital transfer is principally its delivery mechanism versus analog. And this is really what we're talking about, is analog versus digital. Because digitally you can replicate in other ways that really minimizes to the extreme amount the loss you would actually have in the experience. It's the analog stuff that is much more difficult, and that's hard to quantify. So again, it depends on how complete or accurate from a historical perspective you need your archive to be.
Yeah, I'll say also, I hope nobody gets mad at me for this, but in the digital preservation community, the kind of work that we're doing, nobody is really working on the assumption, and I'm going to say really nobody, that we're going to be using original equipment in 100 years, or original media for that matter. Nobody. We're talking about migration, I was talking about these packages and so forth. We're talking about migration from original media to repositories where the data is preserved, and that data will be run on emulators and virtualized environments, those kinds of things. We need to do a lot of research on what the implications of that are for the kind of experience somebody playing the game in 100 years is going to have. But we're familiar with that. You guys, I get mad at my son when he watches a classic movie on his, on YouTube or on something that I saw in a movie theater. I mean, that's a fact of life. You read a paperback and somebody 300 years ago was reading it in a different format. That's fine. But I think the point I want to get across is the target for 100 years from now is not original equipment or original media. It just isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, just sort of echoing that same sentiment. I mean, that's why we are sort of currently focusing on the documentation angle of things, because we know that right now, I mean, we don't even have like a PS3 or Wii or an Xbox to provide the access to the things that we're currently getting yet. So I mean, we're going in that direction of emulation and migration. I mean, it's similar to the way in which if someone wants to watch a 3/4 inch tape from our collection, from our video collection at the library, we don't send up the tape anymore to the Hill for them to watch it. We digitize it and fiber optically send up, that digitized copy for them to watch in our reading room, because, I mean, it's a pain to keep 3/4 inch machines running. It's basically a dead format, and, to us, the information on that tape is really important. I mean, obviously, I think there's more of an emphasis on keeping film, keeping images on film alive, and not so much anymore on video. And I think that's kind of going to be, similar to how we approach gaming in the future.
So, we are out of time. We're actually a little over time. First, I want to ask everybody in the audience if you think you learned something today. Yeah. Raise your hand. So a couple people aren't raising their hands.
Chris, can I just, real quick for my colleagues up here too, please understand that all of this is all new to everybody doing this as well. But, I mean, I won't speak for it, but we come at this from a place as passionate as you are about this. We're lifelong gamers. We understand this history. We live all this stuff. some of the decisions that may seem arbitrary or ridiculous, really coming from a place that is not fully communicated, it comes from a place of respect, right? As much as anything, we want to preserve I know for me, for my kids and my grandchildren, the things that formed and helped shape the path I took in my life. And it happens to revolve almost entirely around, being introduced to video games at a very early age. So, take into consideration as you bring information to us, across all of these different initiatives. We want to hear from people. We want your input, right? This isn't about us doing these things in isolation. This is for everybody. So, thanks for...
Can I get a round of applause for our